I'm going to discuss the Quran. I think it's a very important topic because the Quran, which is the basis for the Islamic way of life, has been abused in many ways. Abused by the Muslims and abused by the non-Muslims also. The way the Muslims abuse the Quran is they don't read it, or they don't reflect upon it, or they don't analyze it and investigate it. And also it's abused by the non-Muslim community by also not reading it and analyzing it, but not also giving it any type of intellectual justice. What do I mean by this? I mean that when people view the Quran or any text, they come with emotional and intellectual baggage, hermeneutics, a frame of reference, and they get their values that they believe in, or some assumptions, or another frame of reference, and they try to superimpose it on a religious text, specifically the Quran. And the way I approach this topic is that we must empty our teacup. There's a Chinese saying, empty your teacup, because if it's full, you can't get more tea in it, right? And today is about getting more tea, more information, more knowledge, more discussion. So therefore, the injustice that's been done to the Quran or any other religious text, or any tablet, or any text, as a matter of fact, is that we take our assumptions and our presumptions and our presuppositions and our frame of reference and our values, and we superimpose them on something new. And today, I think, is about emptying that teacup, removing those presuppositions, those alien values, the things that we already believe in, our assumptions, and not applying them or superimposing them on the Quranic text. I think that's the best way of trying to appreciate the truth of something or the reality of anything, because it doesn't skew the debate. So today's discussion is about the Quran, and I'm specifically going to talk about two main miracles of the Quran. The first miracle is the linguistic and literary miracle of the Quran. The second miracle is what I call a values miracle. The Quran can be called a miracle of values. Now what do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to leave it to your own imagination. I'm going to present that in the second part of the presentation. Now, I'm going to talk about the first part of my presentation, which is the unique literary and linguistic feature of the Quran that renders it a miracle. God, Allah says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. These were the first few words revealed unto the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him, over 1400 years ago. These first few words were the paradigm shift. They totally de-scoped everything. It totally changed everything. From economics to society to politics, and specifically and significantly, it de-scoped the Arabic language. It turned the Arabic language on its head. These first few words had a dramatic intellectual impact on a savage desert Arab nation. For example, the popular historian Karen Armstrong, she states, it is as though Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had created an entirely new literary form. Without this experience of the Quran, it is extremely unlikely that Islam would have taken root. So the first few words revealed unto the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a dramatic effect on the world we live in today and on the world of Arabic literature. But the Quran's impact was not only because of its first few verses. The Quran's impact was because of its message. Its impact was because of it tries to impose itself on you. The Quran, frankly, tries to impose itself on brother, sister, and friend. The Quran tries to impose itself on you. But this imposition is not a negative one. It is a positive one. Why do I say this? Because the Quran was to engage with your mind. It wants to tease your inner dispositions. The Quran wants to agitate your aqliyah, your intellect, and your nafsiyah, your emotional dispositions, your psychology. The Quran wants to tease and agitate it so it can awaken you to certain realities. And how does one do this? I come from a psychology background, and psychologists, what do? They want to agitate your intellectual and your emotional capacities. For psychologists, they ask you questions. How are you feeling, sir? What is your perspective on this, madam? The Quran does exactly the same thing. أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. The Quran says, do they not reflect within themselves? Do they not reflect within their psychological and physiological makeup? Reflect. This is how the Quran tries to agitate intellectual and emotional awareness by teasing the mind and teasing the emotions to bring about some form of understanding of the true reality. But the Quran goes much further than this. The Quran not only asks questions, but it goes much further than this. When the Quran talks about the oneness of God, Tawheed, when the Quran talks about the orbits, the sun, the stars, the natural phenomena, it usually ends with the following psycholinguistic strategy. With a certain strategy, it ends by saying, for those who know, for those who use their minds, for those who reflect. For example, the Quran says, كَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Thus do we explain our signs, our proofs, our evidences for those who reflect. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And this word reflect is not any ordinary word. It's been placed there for a specific reason, because it has semantic value. It has both of meaning. Because this doesn't just mean reflect. Oh, this seems very nice. There's many people in this room. No. This word يَتَفَكَّرُونَ actually means the thing you're reflecting upon, you must acknowledge, understand, and seek its implication. The thing that you're reflecting upon, you must understand and acknowledge the implication of the object that you're reflecting upon. So the Quran does indeed attempt to agitate the intellectual and emotional capacities of the human being. But brothers, sisters and friends, the Quran goes even further than this. Further than even any secular textbook. Further than any religious textbook you have read. Further than any philosopher. Whether it's an ancient Greek philosopher or contemporary philosopher. The Quran goes much further than these texts, these knowledge claims. Why do I say this? I'm not a blind faith fanatic. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the Quran actually poses a falsification test to the whole of humanity. A challenge. An intellectual challenge. The Quran says in Surah Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 23, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And if you, talking to the whole of humanity here, if you are in doubt about that which we have sent down to our servant, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then bring a single chapter like it, which is only 3 lines long. Bring a single chapter like it, and call on your witnesses and your supporters besides God, besides Allah, if you are sadiqeen, if you are truthful. Now, according to the Quranic exegetes, those who explain the Quran for us, the classical tradition, such as Ibn Kathir, Jalalain, and there's chains of knowledge, chains of narration attributed to the companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ibn Abbas, may Allah, may God be pleased with him. They conclude there is an ijma', a consensus amongst classical scholarship, and to be honest, even amongst Western scholarship, such as Arbery, Marble, Shamir, Jones, Lawrence. They conclude that this challenge has something to do with the nature, the feature, and the style of the Quranic language. There's something special about the language in the Quran. Something unique, something wonderful, something amazing, something awe-inspiring, something beyond this world. And this has a historical context, because we know at the time of revelation over 1400 years ago, the Quran was revealed onto a people who were the best at expressing themselves in the Arabic language. The Quraysh, the Arabs at that time, they were Arab linguists par excellence. They were the best. As the Arabs say, khalas, full stop. There is no debate about this. They were the best at expressing themselves in the Arabic language. For example, Ibn Rashid, a famous historian, he states, whenever a poet emerged in an Arab tribe, other tribes would come to congratulate, feasts would be prepared, the women would join together on lutes as they do at weddings, and old and young men would all rejoice at the good news. The Arabs used to congratulate each other only on the birth of a child, and when a poet rose among them. So the Quran came to challenge humanity, and it also came specifically to challenge the Quraysh, to challenge the Arabs at the time of revelation. And we know all these challenges failed. And how do we know this? And this is a motivation for the sisters. There is a sheikha, a woman scholar from Al-Azhar University who died in 1970s. And she developed a book that compiled all the challenges to the Quran and proposed her responses and her refutation to all those challenges of the Quran. Her name was Aisha Abdul Rahman, also known as Bint Shati. And this was a woman preserving the intellectual heritage of the Islamic way of life. And this is reflected amongst the Western scholarship also. Foster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, he was a notable British Orientalist and Arabist, he states, and though several attempts have been made to produce a work equal to it, referring to the Quran, as far as elegant writing is concerned, none has yet succeeded. So we can establish now there's something special and unique about the Quran. But what is this special nature or feature? Well, there are four main arguments, and I'm going to summarize these four main arguments for you now. The first argument is that the Quran is a unique literary form. Its structural features, the mechanics of the Arabic language, are unique in the Quran. Generally, in the Arabic language, we have two main forms of speech. We have prose and we have poetry. Now, prose can be subdivided in two other categories called rhyme prose and normal speech, also known in Arabic as saj'a and mursal. Now, rhyme prose is defined in the following way. It has an end rhyme. It has a rhythmical pattern based upon the accent rather than the syllables. For example, in the English language we have nursery rhymes, and they're based upon accent rhythms, accent-based rhythms. An example is black sheep, happy little. You see, that's based upon the accent of the rhythm rather than the syllables. And finally, the definition of rhyme prose or saj'a is that it has a concentrated use of rhetorical features. So that's rhyme prose. Mursal, straightforward speech, is just like the speech I'm talking to you today, to excite some form of awareness or intellectual activity in the masses. Now there's poetry. Now Arabic poetry is very mathematical. Its definition is as follows. It ends with a rhyme, and it has a syllable-based rhythmical pattern. And these rhythmical patterns, called the al-bihar, bahar, are 16 or 17. And pre-Islamic and post-Islamic poetry, according to Luis Chico, who did an analysis of pre-Islam and post-Islam poetic literature, and concluded that all of this poetry referred to these 16 or 17 rhythmical patterns. Now, one of these rhythmical patterns, for example, called at-tawil, goes like this. Ba, 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 ba. That's the rhythm of the poem. So that's poetry. Now when we're trying to get these measurements, these yardsticks, these descriptions, and try to superimpose them on any chapter of the Quran, we understand that the Quran is not rhyme prose, it's not straightforward speech, and it's not poetry. Rather, the Quran is a unique text with regards to the structural features of language. Just like Arthur J. Arbery, the famous Orientalist and translator of the Quran, he said, the Quran is neither prose nor poetry. And also Tahir Hussein, a famous Egyptian Arabic literature, he said the Quran is neither verse, it's not poetic, and it's not prose. Rather, it is Quran. The second argument is more based upon modern day linguistics, contemporary linguistic theory. And the second argument is that the Quran is a unique linguistic genre, which basically means the Quran takes two features of language and marries them together in such a way that if you were to strip those features away, you would cease to hear something like the Quran. It would cease to be a Quran. And these features are rhetorical features and cohesive features. Rhetorical features in the Arabic Islamic tradition is language that intends to please and persuade. And cohesive features is, for example, grammatical particles that intend to link concepts and ideas and words together. A very simple one is the conjunctive particle wa, which basically means and. Can also indicate things happening in parallel. But it links things together, it acts like a cohesive device. So the Quran captures rhetorical language and cohesive language and marries them in such a way that if you try to strip those features away from the Quran, it would cease to sound like a Quran. The third example, or the third argument rather, is that the Quran can only be described as a peak of eloquence. Its language is superior. Now what do we mean here by eloquence? We mean the most perfect delivery, the most perfect communicative effect, and also the most perfect choice and arrangement of words, letters, grammatical particles, and sounds. Let me give you an example. Let me take just the shortest chapter of the Quran and just the first verse of the shortest chapter of the Quran to show to you that the Quran is indeed a literary masterpiece and it has miraculous eloquence. This is the first verse of the shortest chapter of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إِنَّ أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ. Indeed, unquestionably, verily, we have given you, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the abundance, al-Kawthar. Now we know this chapter came as a result of the Arabs at the time of the Prophet. They were degrading him, they were abusing him, they were boycotting him. And we also know it came specifically because the sons of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had died. So they abused him, calling him abtar. You are cut off, you have no lineage, you are nothing. So this chapter came to console the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And just look at the first verse, just to scratch the intellectual surface a bit, just to show how this first verse is indeed a peak of eloquence. So the Quran starts, Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. Inna here, the emphatic particle, indicating surety, unquestionably, indeed. And it also chooses the personal pronoun for we. Allah, God, the speaker, talks about himself as we, indeed we. Instead of using Rabbika, your Lord, it uses we. Why is that? Because when we look into the Quran, the personal pronoun we is used for majesty and power and ability. When it talks about ability and punishment, for example, Allah refers to himself as we, which indicates ability. So this is a perfect choice of pronoun here, because Allah or the Quran is saying that something is being given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to make it of more impact and more surety, it uses the personal pronoun we for majesty, ability, and power. Then also we have the word atayna. Now this word is the most perfect word for this context. Why is this the case? Because if we were to compare this word with similar words in the Arabic language, specifically in the classical dictionaries of Arabic, we could not find a better word. Why is this the case? Because this word has two added connotations not found anywhere else in the Arabic language. Two added connotations. And these connotations are as follows. It is that the thing that you are giving, you own, which indicates more surety and more emphasis. Secondly, the thing that you are giving with your own hand, which indicates even more of a surety and ability. So this word is the perfect choice of word here. And then finally, we have al-kawthar, the abundance. Now we know, according to the hadith literature, which are narrations attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this word means a river in paradise. So it has a Sharia meaning here. According to Qurtubi and Ibn Taymiyyah, and I believe Ibn Abbas, this word also has semantic value. It has multi-layered meanings. The triliteral stem for this word is kafara, which you could have many words such as kathir, which means plentiful and many. So this word also means many, plentiful, and abundance. And it doesn't only refer to a river in paradise. So it has multi-layered meaning here. But specifically what is greater here is the placement of the word. According to Qurtubi, he said the placement of this word is unique. It's at the end of the verse. Because God is saying plentiful. The plentiful of what? The plentiful of companions? The plentiful of believers? It's not qualified by anything. It's open-ended. And it's a rhetorical device called ellipsis, which basically means that you make a statement and you do not qualify it to indicate much in this context. So let us review just these few, 3 or 4 letters here, words here. Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. Verily, we have given you the abundance. We start with emphasis, emphatic particle inna. The perfect choice of pronoun, we. The perfect choice of meaning, atayna, which has greater semantic value. The greater perfect choice of al-kawthar, the word here, because it has multi-layered meaning, and its placement in the position of the verse, which is at the end, meaning plentiful of everything. Because we know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is guaranteed Jannah. We know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is going to have the highest status in Jannah, paradise. We know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had victory in his political life and his spiritual life. We know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the leader of all the prophets. He was the imam of all the prophets, including Isa, Jesus alayhi salam, and Musa alayhi salam. And also, we know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had the most companions. So indeed, Allah, God, has indeed given the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ abundance of everything. So this is the unique feature of the Quran. The third argument here, which is eloquence. And we, just superficially looking at the first verse of the shortest chapter in the Quran, we can come to the conclusion that if we were to take away the words and try and put better words in a different order, a different placement, a different meaning, we could not do so. They'd be all divinely put there. The last argument, the fourth argument, is the abundance of rhetorical features. Now, as I said, rhetoric in the Arabic Islamic tradition means language that intends to please and persuade. And the Quran, according to Abdul Rauf, Abdul Halim, Abu Musa, many other contemporary linguists and past linguists like Abu Rumani and Al-Baqilani, they say that the Quran is a sea of rhetoric. It has more rhetorical features than any other text, past or present. And some of these features include analogy, alliteration, antiphrasis, antithesis, accidenton, assonance, cadence, isocolon, metaphor, parenthesis, polyton, rhetorical question, stress. The Quran is a sea of rhetoric. unparalleled, and cannot be compared with any other text, past or present. Now, the Quran is unique. We can argue that. We come to the conclusion that the Quran is unique. It has some special features. Unique literary form, unique linguistic genre, it's a peak of eloquence, it's a sea of rhetoric. It's unique, it's unparalleled. But how does this make it divine? How does this make it divine text? I'll ask you this question. How does the Quran be unique, make it a divine text? Let me give you a challenge here. Shakespeare is known to have very unique works in the English language. And Shakespeare is a human being, but his work is unique. So if the Quran is unique, then therefore it can also be from a human being, because Shakespeare is unique. However, there's a problem here. Shakespeare's work has to do with a different type of uniqueness. Shakespeare's work has to do with the aesthetic reception. How the language is grabbing your attention. It's about aesthetics. How awe-inspiring Romeo and Juliet may be, or Macbeth, or any other of his plays. But the Quran's uniqueness is not only due to the aesthetic reception. The Quran's uniqueness is about the structural features of the text. There's a big difference here. Because Shakespeare's work wasn't in a unique structural feature. Shakespeare's work was in a feature called the iambic pentameter. And the iambic pentameter in the English language was used by many. For example, Christopher Marlowe as an example, one of his contemporaries. So there's a difference between Shakespeare's uniqueness and the Quranic uniqueness, because it has to do with the structural features of the text. So still, how does it make it divine? How is the Quran from God based upon what we've just said? Well, there's two ways of finding out. There's two ways. The first way is using something called rational deduction, and the second way is the philosophy of miracles. Let's talk about the first way. Now, rational deduction, or what is known as logical deduction, is the thinking process where you take a universally accepted statement, and from that, you make logical conclusions. Now, in the context of the Quran, what is the universally accepted statement amongst Eastern and Western scholarship? Well, it's very simple. According to Eastern and Western scholarship, such as Abdul Halim, Abdul Rauf, Abu Musa, Anthony Jones, Bruce Lawrence, Arthur J. Arbery, Hamilton Gibb, Margaret Mir, all these Orientalists and Arabists, they conclude, there's a consensus at Ijma'a, that the Arabs at the time of revelation, who were best placed to challenge the Quran, failed to challenge the Quran. This is the universally accepted statement. I repeat, the Arabs at the time of revelation, who were best placed to challenge the Quran, failed to challenge the Quran. This is the universally accepted statement. Now from this, together, let's make some logical conclusions. First logical conclusion. Could it be from an Arab? No, it can't, because the best placed Arabs could not produce it. And the Arabs today have undergone a thing called, a phenomenon called linguistic degeneration. The language today is not as rich, but it's not used in its richness as it was 1400 years ago. There's been a linguistic degeneration. The second point then, the second logical conclusion. Can it be from a non-Arab? Of course not, because you need to know the Arabic language. Third logical conclusion. Therefore it must be from God. Wait a minute, Mr. Hamzah Tzortzis. Too fast. What if it's the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him? Some people claim that he was a genius. There are 8 reasons why the Quran, from a linguistic and literary point of view, why it could not have come from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. First reason, he was also an Arab, and the best Arab at the time failed to challenge the Quran. Second reason, the literary character of the Quran, the emotions in the Quran, are antithetical to the emotions experienced by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his prophetic career. In his 23 years of his prophetic career, we know that he underwent boycott, oppression. His beloved wife Khadija died. His children died. His Sahaba, his companions, were tortured and murdered and killed. And all of this emotion is not reflected in the Quran. Rather, the Quran always remains in the divine voice. The literary character of the Quran is not in line with the emotion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced. If he was the author, then surely some of that emotion would trickle through. It is a psychological impossibility for any author, specifically revealing a text of a 23-year period, would not reflect some of those emotions, especially if his prophetic career was such an emotional roller coaster. Third reason, the hadith, the narrations attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are totally different from the Quran. They're two different distinct styles. And it's also a psychological impossibility to utter two distinct styles over a 23-year period. Now someone may argue, what about a poet? A poet utters his normal speech and his poetic speech throughout his career. I agree, but poetry and normal speech share structural similarities, whereas the Quran is distinctively, structurally beyond any of the forms that we know. Fourth argument, which is a very interesting argument, is arrangement. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take Surah Baqarah, chapter 2 as an example, which was revealed over a 9 or 10-year period. Now Surah Baqarah, the chapter of the Kaaba, was revealed for specific times, in specific places, over 9 or 10 years. However, Surah Baqarah is structurally coherent, which basically means it's a chapter that has a literary coherence. It's not a jumbled mess. It's actually coherent. If we read Neil Robertson's book, The Quran, a contemporary approach to the text, we see a very interesting analysis on how the largest chapter of the Quran, Surah Baqarah, is a coherent text. Now the argument is this. If Surah Baqarah was revealed over different times and different places for specific circumstances, then how can it be collected to be a coherent text? Surely, if you start the conclusion, then you start with the introduction, then go back to the conclusion, then start writing the main part of your essay, it's going to be a jumbled mess. And specifically, if these parts had to do with things that were happening in the future. So this only indicates that the author must have known the future. Because it seems that Surah Baqarah was already written before it was revealed in specific places and specific times. So this arrangement theory actually shows that it could not have come from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The fifth reason why the Quran can't be from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is because any human expression can be imitated, as long as we have the blueprint of that expression. For example, Shakespeare's work, as an example, can easily be imitated because we have the blueprint to his work. That's why some of the English scholars, they say that Christopher Marlowe was actually the author to some of Shakespeare's work. Just like some art. So we have this art form called post-impressionism. It's a form of art. And because we have the art today, we can easily copy it and replicate post-impressionism. But the Quran still cannot be replicated, even though we have the blueprint, which is the Quran itself. We can read the Quran, we can understand the Quran, we can hear the rhythm of the Quran, we can see the placement of the words, the meaning of the words, and their order. So we have the blueprint of the Quran, but even so, we cannot imitate it. But yet with any human expression, if we have the blueprint, we can't imitate it. This is why, again, it could not be from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The sixth aspect why the Quran can't be from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is because the Quraysh, the Arabs at the time of revelation, never accused the Prophet of being the author. They would say, this is magic. Or he learned it from someone else. They never accused him of being the author. The seventh point is that there are some statements in the Quran that actually rebuke the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And according to that political environment, it would be seen as a politically naive thing to do to rebuke yourself if you want to gain leadership and authority amongst your peers and contemporaries. But yet the Quran rebukes the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Eighth point is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually, he didn't have any sort of schooling in the arts of rhetoric and eloquence. So for all these 8 reasons, it is impossible to say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is actually the author of the Quran. So let's go to our next logical conclusion now. He must speak from God then. No. Mr. Hamzah Tzortzis, you're going too fast again. Some people claim, some people from the Christian community and other peoples of different philosophical tendencies, they say that the Quran then could come from a higher being, like a jinn or shaitan, the devil. There's a problem with the argument though. There's a big problem with it. Because for someone to claim that the Quran, although it is an ingenious piece of work, but it came from the devil or it came from a jinn, there's a problem. Because I ask the questioner, dear questioner, how do you know jinns exist and the devils exist? Why, Mr. Hamzah Tzortzis? It says it in the Quran itself. Also, you believe in the Quran, do you? Do you see the problem here? It's circular reasoning. In order for them to justify their claim that the jinn or shaitan is the source of the Quran, they have to first justify that these 2 sources exist. And if they use the Quran, then they don't have to disprove the Quran because they believe its knowledge claims are correct. And then if they say, well, the Bible, the Torah says so, then the argument is not if the Quran was expressed by a jinn or a devil, but rather the argument is your Bible or your Torah true? Because if you believe what they say, they must have some form of justification. They're making knowledge claims about things we cannot see. So how do you believe them, sir? Then they have to have a discussion. The onus of proof is on them to prove the divinity of those 2 texts. So let's go to the last possible logical conclusion. Let's repeat. It can't be an Arab. We gave the reasons. It can't be a non-Arab. We gave the reasons. It can't be the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We gave 8 detailed reasons. It can't be from a jinn or a devil. We've just given the reasons. So who is it next? Who is it from next? We are grasping at intellectual straws here. We cannot find a naturalistic explanation. Therefore, it is from something that we know exists for those who believe in a God. It is from the Creator. This is the first way of acknowledging that the Quran is definitely from the Creator. But there's also another way, and it's called the philosophy of miracles. Now, what is a miracle? Now, generally, the very ironclad perspective of miracles, the old view on miracles was that it's anything that goes against natural law. And what is natural law? Natural law are our perceived patterns of the universe. But there's a problem with that old description. The problem is what if that deviation of that pattern, or the thing that went against the natural law, what if it is still part of the pattern? It's not a very coherent way of viewing miracles. Because we could just say, if it happened, then it's not a miracle, because it's still part of the pattern. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, they saw this planet. It's called Mars. And Mars goes around the sun, like this. After a few more years, they saw another planet. And he went around the sun like this. So, the perceived pattern is that they're all doing elliptical orbits. However, when they finally went to see Pluto, it went inside Uranus' orbit. It wasn't elliptical anymore. Does that mean it's a miracle? No. is still part of the pattern because we're observing it. So things that goes against natural law, which is only our observations of the universe, may still be part of the pattern. There could be exceptions. So that understanding of miracle is incorrect. However, the more modern, contemporary philosophical understanding of miracle, for example, according to William Craig, an infamous philosopher, he says that miracles are actually acts of impossibilities. Things you just cannot explain naturalistically. And he says it in the following words: a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature. What does this mean? I use this bottle as an example, yeah? This bottle is made of plastic. There's some water in it. Now, if I take the lid away from the bottle, you still have a lid, and you have a bottle. And if I put the lid back on the bottle, you have the lid of the bottle. And now if I went like this, and voila, I created the brother here. You'd be like, no, that's impossible. Exactly. And I'm going to give the example of the Quran now. We have the Quran, which is unique. To explain the uniqueness of the Quran, we have to go to the language of Arabic. So we go to the language of Arabic. Finite 28 letters, finite grammatical rules, a limited set of numbers of letters and words and grammatical rules. And when we put them in combination, we exhaust all the combinations, we can't produce the Quran. So it's an impossibility. Because we've tried all the combinations, but we cannot produce the Quranic structure. So it's the event, the nature of the Quranic language, which is the Arabic, can't explain the uniqueness of the language in the Quran. It's an impossibility. Surely it must do. Just like this, you saw me do an act here and I shook the bottle and look, there's a human being. You saw the nature of the event, which is this, and the event is the brother being produced. But this is impossible because when we try and analyze the bottle and water and plastic, you can never ever get a human being. C'est impossible, as the French say. Impossible. But yet the event was here, the nature of the event is here, and the event is over there. We can't find a logical link or any rational link, no naturalistic explanation. Just like with the Quran. The Quran is unique. It's a unique linguistic event. When we go to the nature of that event, the Arabic language, and we exhaust all possibilities, we're scratching our head, we're trying to understand how this happened, but yet we could never produce anything like the Quran. So we can't have a link between the Quran and the Arabic language. But yet, the Quran is made of Arabic language. So it's an act. It's an event that's impossible. It's an act of impossibilities. So going back to the original definition, if a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature, then surely the Quran is also a miracle. Because the Quran lies outside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. So using two methods, rational deduction and philosophy of miracles, we can only conclude that the Quran is definitely from the Creator. Let us listen to some Western scholarship. The highly acclaimed professor and Arabist Hamilton Gibb, he says the following: the Meccans still demand of him a miracle, and with remarkable boldness and self-confidence, Muhammad appealed as a supreme confirmation of his mission to the Quran itself. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well then, if your Quran were his own composition, other men would rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it, and if they could not, and it is obvious that they could not, then let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. Paul Casanova in April 1909 at the College of France, he said, whenever Muhammad was asked a miracle as a proof of the authenticity of his mission, he quoted the composition of the Quran and its incomparable excellence as proof of its divine origin. Professor Bruce Lawrence, he says in his new book called The Quran, a Biography, in page 8, he says, Quranic verses, Quranic signs are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning laid within meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. And one of my favorites, Reverend R. Bosworth Smith, he concludes in his book, Muhammad and Mohammedanism, he says that the Quran is a miracle of purity of style, of wisdom and of truth. It is the one miracle claimed by Muhammad, his standing miracle, and a miracle indeed it is. This is the literary and linguistic miracle of the Quran. Now, I also talked about the values miracle of the Quran. And what does this mean? I'm going to briefly discuss the values miracle in the Quran also. Well, Kenneth Cragg was a professor at Oxford University. And Kenneth Cragg, he wrote in his book the following about the Quran. He says, multitudes of mankind will need to be guided and persuaded Quranically. And this leads to my second part of my presentation on the values miracle of the Quran. So we've already discussed the linguistic and literary miracle of the Quran. And using scholarly work and a scholarly approach, we came to a conclusion at the end, using rational deduction and the philosophy of miracles, that the Quran can only be from the divine. But let's talk about the values miracle. You may be so confused. What am I talking about, the values miracle? Anyone know what I'm talking about? While I drink my tea very quickly. Put your hand up. Come on, anyone know? Have a guess. Come on, this is Swansea University. It's the center of the height of intellectual activity. Surely you can guesstimate, which is guess and estimate put together. Okay, because you're very shy. Oh, thank you.
I think it means the human and societal values.
Thank you. Someone's been listening and he also has a pen, writing notes. MashaAllah. Okay, he's right. What I'm talking about is, if the Quran, its values, its societal values, has done something that no one has been able to do, then surely it's also a miracle of values. I appreciate that my main presentation was about the unique literary form and the structure and the miraculous nature of the Quran, and we've concluded that. But just to make the Quran a bit more real in life, I'm not one to talk about intellectual gymnastics. We could do intellectual gymnastics all day. Yeah? With our brains. Muscles in our mind. Although the mind has no muscles, but I think you get the point. I want to make the Quran real. That it has affected people and it has produced positive solutions for mankind. I'm going to use contemporary society as an example. And we could discuss this and you can elaborate this more in the question and answers. Generally, in modern day society, specifically in the Western society, we in the West, we are governed by a set of ideas called liberal values or liberalism. In political philosophy, it's called liberalism. Now, liberalism focuses on two key aspects, which is individual rights, the privacy, the priority of individual rights, and an emphasis on individual freedoms. Now the underlying presupposition, the underlying premise for these political values is this core idea called atomism, or in popular language discourse is called individualism. For example, the political philosopher Charles Taylor, he states, the very idea of starting an argument whose foundation was the rights of the individual would have been strange and puzzling. He's referring to historical context here. He says, why do we even begin to find it reasonable to start a political theory with an assertion of individual rights and to give this primacy? The answer to this question lies in the hold on us of what I have called atomism, or what some people say, individualism. Now what is individualism? Well, individualism is viewing the human being, brother, sister and friend, as an abstract entity divorced away from social obligations and attachments and responsibilities and any form of social link. This is atomism, this is individualism. And the premise here, the Quran views individualism, and many other political philosophers also views individualism as something false. It just doesn't make any sense. Why is that the case? A few main reasons. One, there are social attachments that make up who we are as a human being. Two, aims and values must be considered when trying to understand a human being or society, and aims and values can only be understood in a social context. There is a dynamic link between the individual and society individual. It's not just individualistic. For example, the famous social constructionist Vivian Mayer, she says, and she uses a capitalist society as an example. She says, for example, in a capitalist society, competition is fundamental. Society is structured around individuals and organizations that compete with each other for jobs, etc. So where competition is a fundamental feature of social and economic life, what you would get is competitive people. So there's a relationship between individuals, their values, and society, and vice versa. So just to summarize what individualism is, the political philosopher, and she's a feminist actually, political philosopher Marian Friedman, she says, individualism considers human beings as social atoms, abstracted from the social context, and disregards the role of social relationships and human community in constituting the very identity and nature of individual human beings. Now this is the problem. I would argue that this is the problem in our modern day societies, specifically America and Britain. Why do I say this? Well, in Britain alone, there's over 48,000 rapes committed each year. 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence. We have knife crime on the increase. Murders in London specifically are on the increase. The statistics are going towards astronomical levels. We had the tragic story of baby P that was abused and tortured for 17 months, the first 17 months of its life, and it was found dead with a broken back and broken ribs. This is the reality of today. It's specific to the vulnerable in our society. 7% of all children, 7%, that's a huge number, of all children suffer from a form of child abuse. And social breakdown. A judge, Justice Coleridge, he has to say the following. The social breakdown is on a level, it's on a scale, depth and breadth, which few of us could have never imagined a decade ago. It is a never-ending carnival of human misery, a ceaseless river of human distress. And if anyone were to read the current February 2009 Children's Society report, it concluded that the US and Britain, the main liberal societies that propagate liberal values, have got the worst record for the well-being of children, even if you compare that to third world states and nations. There's a problem. And you know what it said in this report, in the Children's Society, which was advertised on the BBC and on the news? It concluded that the reason for this is excessive individualism. Something that I'm talking about today, which is the premise of liberalism. Now I would say the Quran is very unique in this way because it doesn't have a false premise. It views society in a very specific way. It says that the individual affects society and society affects the individual. And there must be a symbiotic relationship. And this is best described in the hadith, the narration attributed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the following way. The Prophet ﷺ described society as such. Society is like a boat. And in that boat, there's an upper deck and a lower deck. And the lower deck, in order to obtain water, needs to get it from the upper deck. But all of a sudden, and I'm ad-libbing here, all of a sudden, the lower deck want to become individualistic. So they make a hole in the bottom deck, and what happens to the boat? It sinks, i.e. social breakdown. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is telling us that there's a relationship between individuals and society, and it must be structured in a certain way. And it's structured in the Quranic view by propagating cohesive values, because individualism is a non-cohesive value. It doesn't bring anyone together, it doesn't create ideas that are positive or create positive behaviors. But the Quran seeks to propagate justice, mercy, compassion, empathy, distribution of resources. Now someone may argue, these are liberal values too. Yeah, they may be. But the Quran doesn't create competition between non-cohesive values and cohesive values, such as justice and mercy. And I'm going to use history as an example of the proof of my thesis here. Because today I would argue that there is no nation that is propagating Quranic values. For example, many people claim Saudi Arabia is propagating Quranic values. I would disagree. Because if we look at its economy, it's capitalist. If we look at some of its political model, it's fascist. So it's capitalist fascist. Many people may argue. I'm not saying this, but if we scratch the surface a bit, we look beyond the social system of Islam. We have women covered and men who pray. If we look beyond that, we see that it doesn't really have the Quranic values. So I have to use history because it did exist in history. And I'm going to use some fascinating results here. I'm going to use the Jewish community. Because the Jewish minorities have been oppressed by everyone. They've been oppressed by every ism and ideology. And look what the Jews had to say under Quranic values. And that's why I say it's a value miracle. Because under no other time have the Jews have said these statements and had such prosperity. And just listen to this. An Italian rabbi, Obadia Yare de Bettiloro, he traveled to Jerusalem, where we see many problems today, in 1486. And he wrote a letter to his father telling him about the country and its people. He says, "The Jews are not persecuted by the Arabs in these parts. I have traveled through the country in its length and breadth, and none of them has put an obstacle in my way. They are very kind to strangers, particularly to anyone who does not know the language. And if they see many Jews together, they are not annoyed by it. In my opinion, an intelligent man versed in political science can easily raise himself to be chief of the Jews as well as of the Arabs." A Portuguese Jewish chronicler, Samuel Usk, elaborates on the Jewish migrant situation in the city of Salonika under Uthmani rule. He says, "The majority of my children who have been persecuted and exiled from Europe and many other parts of the world have taken refuge in the city, and she embraces them and receives them with as much love and goodwill as if she were Jerusalem, the old and ever pious mother of ours." Another Italian Jewish traveler, David de Rossi, traveled through the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century, and he documented his observance into the conditions of the Jews. He says in these words, "The exile here is not like in our homeland. The Turks, i.e. the Muslims, hold respectable Jews in esteem. Here in Alexandria, Egypt, Jews are the chief officers and administrators of the customs and the king's revenues. No injuries are perpetrated against them in all the empire." And we have a whole list. I could go on and on and on what the Jewish community have said under the Quranic values. For example, Benjamin of Toluda, a Spanish Jew who traveled to Baghdad, which will see more problems in the year 1168. And he described the situation of the Iraqi Jews in these words. "In Baghdad, there are about 40,000 Jews, and they dwell in security, prosperity, and honor under the great Caliph." And also, we have even more statements. For example, Zion Zohar, he was a modern Jewish historian, and he says, "Thus, when the Muslims crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, the Jews saw them as liberators from Christian persecution." And I believe this is directly as a result of the Quran, and I can't speak about all the verses in the Quran, but let me talk about one specific verse that summarizes its political value with regards to people like the Jews. It says, "O you who believe, be steadfast witnesses for God in justice, and let not the hatred of others make you swerve from justice. Do justly, that is nearer to your duty. Observe your duty to God. Indeed, God is informed of what you do." To summarize my presentation, we can conclude that the Quran is a literary and linguistic miracle. Its uniqueness is due to its unique literary form, its unique linguistic genre, its unparalleled eloquence, it's the peak of eloquence, and it is a sea of rhetoric. It has more rhetorical features than any other text. Its uniqueness is particularly amazing because it's to do with the structural features of a text and not just the aesthetic perception like Shakespeare, rather it goes beyond that. And we can prove this from the divine using two approaches, rational deduction and the philosophy of miracles, which we discussed. And also, the second part of the presentation, we said the Quran is a values miracle because its values, in contrast to the premise of liberalism, which is individualism, atomism, which views the individual disassociated from a social context, and we can see by the statistics, and even the Children's Society report has told us that it's to do with liberal values that we've had this social breakdown. About 1400 years ago, we had the set of values that were revealed to us that actually made the Jews say what they had to say across centuries, which is unparalleled historically and contemporary in any other society. So we can logically conclude that the Quran is indeed from the Creator. Anything that I have said that is wrong, negative, offensive has come from my nafs, my ego, and shaitan, Satan. Anything that I have said is good and positive, indeed, unquestionably, has come from Islam, come from Allah, God. So I end, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Unquestionably, indeed, without a doubt, all praises are due to Allah, due to God. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, so that's a very, very deep question. The brother was saying, why hasn't the Muslims today abandoned the values of the Quran? It's a huge discussion. I'm just going to summarize it in one way. Because of the eventual decline of the Muslims, as a result of not adhering to the Arabic language, not referring to the source text of Islam, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, which is the way and the path of the Prophet Muhammad, and not referring to the Quran with regards to individual and societal matters, they started to decline. And then they declined even further because they thought there was this emerging nation called, Western liberalism, if you like, and the Enlightenment, and they said that must be good, so therefore whatever they have, we must superimpose it onto the Quran, and that was a problem. So in a way it was because of the absence of the Islamic values, that's why it declined. Okay, I want to answer some of the basic questions. I'm rushing this because I have a train to catch. Can you argue the Quran has been copied from the Bible or the Torah? People have argued that before. It's a very old, outdated, regurgitated Orientalist argument. To even substantiate that claim, you would have to argue that the Prophet Muhammad had a library of Alexandrian proportions, this size. And not only did he have a library that size, but every time he chose a book to get a specific knowledge claim, he had to correct the book at the same time as well, which was highly impossible. I mean, it's irrational to say similarity means copying. It doesn't make any sense. That's an irrational claim. And when we do look at the certain claims of the Quran that may be similar to the Bible, we always see that the Quran corrects the Bible from contemporary historical works. How can we make people interested to know the Quran? Very quickly, just read the Quran. Aisha said about the Prophet Muhammad that he was a walking Quran. So if someone sees how someone is unique, individual, he or she is confident, is able, can have an intellectual discourse, can humble themselves, can speak to a wide range of people, has got good morals, good akhlaq, has got very good behavior towards his parents and towards other people, and is compassionate, but just, merciful, but stern when necessary. He's a holistic human being. Surely they say, where did they get this from? And you just show them where they got it from, which is the Quran. How did Muslims in the West overcome the disease of individualism? The way to do this is essentially by reflecting on the Quran and the Hadith, which teach us about our social obligations. It's very important. And another way of doing it is by showing the negative fruits of liberalism and individualism, such as the social breakdown we are witnessing today. And there's a key concept in Islam called commanding the ma'ruf and forbidding the munkar, commanding the good and forbidding the evil. And when we take this as an obligation, which is an obligation upon the Muslim, then they would understand that commanding the good and forbidding the evil is essential with regards to the obligations towards their Lord, and hence that concept itself takes you away from the individualistic outlook, because you would understand that you have to be part of the community to engage the good and forbid the evil. It's one more. We got 5 minutes. Any more from the floor?
Because you said that it is still people don't understand how the Quran was made from the Arabic language. It is so unique. Can't it be that people still haven't fully understood the Quran itself? But many things in science, people believe in something.
Excellent. See, the difference between science and language is this. Science, you have an infinite number of combinations of techniques and natural phenomena to observe to come to certain conclusions. Whereas language, you don't have an infinite number of techniques or phenomena to observe. You only have 28 letters and a limited amount of words. And the argument is that they have been exhausted and yet you cannot produce the Quran.
What if you say that some of the alphabets, maybe they've been lost?
That's impossible. That's conspiratorial. It's equivalent of me saying that the universe was created by a large pink elephant with feathers and lived on Pluto. No, but I'll tell you why it's impossible. It's because the Arabic language is very unique, because it's been preserved pre-Quran and post-Quran. And it's been preserved in classical dictionaries, unlike any other text which has gone through a whole evolution. For example, English has changed. And English is a pidgin language. Many different languages came together and they spoke, and then English came about. Well, the Quran started from a certain root. It's a Semitic language, isn't it? So no one has ever claimed there was 25 letters of Arabic language, or there's going to be another 2. It's set and it's final with this case. So that claim can't be argued. It's an unsubstantiated claim because it has no evidence to prove the claim. You see, and that's why I said it's equivalent to me saying, an elephant lives on the Pluto.
That you've got nothing to prove. That it has always been that. There have been many languages which came towards back.
Yeah, that's right. The reason languages have changed is because we've seen them change. That phenomena has been witnessed. With the Arabic language, the phenomena of Arabic changing, one, has not been witnessed, and secondly, there was mechanisms in place throughout its history to actually preserve it. So to pose that claim, there's an absence of evidence. Do you see? So a wise person, according to any philosophical tradition, David Hume, for example, he would say, you take the greatest evidence. And the greatest evidence for your claim is that actually the Arabic has been preserved because there's evidence for it. There is no evidence for the Arabic language not being preserved. Because we can understand the Quran today, for example. It's been 1400 years. So for 1400 years we know it hasn't changed because we can still understand the Quran.
There are so many other holy books which people still can't completely understand. So why wouldn't it be the same with this?
Yeah, I think you're missing the point. The point is, fine, those claims, that's true. Greek language has changed, many other languages have changed. So we're talking about the Quran here, isn't it? Yeah? And so you can't apply that concept onto the Quran or Arabic because the language has been preserved by the classical dictionaries, Ibn Maldul's dictionary, for example, the classical traditions, the classical works. The Quran itself is a preservation of the Arabic language, and also there has been no manipulation of the Arabic language throughout its history. So to claim that it has been changed, you need evidence.